Broadway campus.
When Steve Weiser approached me about some suggestions as to what to do for Black History Month, I was delighted because it gave me as a historian an opportunity to take the discussion perhaps in another direction. And with that in mind, I approached Maurice Sweeney, the son of P.O. Sweeney, who I met a long time ago when I was the director of exhibits at the Center for African American Heritage. And we were building a storyline there. And that is how I came to meet Maurice Sweeney, who, like many family members of folks who had historic significance in the Black community, had been very good about collecting memorabilia and just protecting the history of his father, P.O. Sweeney. And so, now let me see if I know how to, oh, there we go. So I approached Mr. Sweeney about talking about his dad based on our community's appreciation for the Old Walnut Street district. That's a topic that many people warm up to very easily. They have fond memories of Walnut Street, the music, the nightclubs, that sort of thing. And it turns out that P.O. Sweeney, who was Dr. P.O. Sweeney, he was a dentist here in the community, among other things, was very involved with many of the business undertakings in Old Walnut Street, and had done much more than what we remember today. And when you look into him more deeply, and I'm hoping Mr. Sweeney, Maurice, can maybe in a couple of months or next year bring the story of his dad to the forefront in the community. He was like a Renaissance man. And it's amazing where he was in terms of the politics of the time. So whenever there was something happening, Mr. Sweeney or Dr. Sweeney was there. When I talked to Maurice about this presentation, as folks who are in the African American community, who are trying to protect the history and increase the interest in the history, and as historians in general, we face a lot of uphill battles in terms of introducing folks to new things that they're not used to hearing about. And, you know, the research is an issue. Does anybody even care anymore? I'm afraid people don't care anymore about our history sometimes. And then what happens when the dominant culture suddenly recognizes, oh, this is interesting history, it's significant, what can we do with it? And so there's a lot of taking on our history and misrepresenting the history in ways that are not desirable. I like to use Elijah Mars as an example. When I was at the Center for African American Heritage, we had historian advisors who came in and helped us a lot in terms of finding the data and telling the story. And one of our advisors, who I respect very much and like very much, when we were approaching the topic of the Civil War and the colored troops, said to me, well, you know, there's not really much there. They just cleaned the trains and they cooked, and that's about it. And so I'm glad I knew better. So Mr. Mars is an example I like to give because his history in this community is just so profound. He was born enslaved in Shelby County. He walked away from slavery with about 24 men. He gathered people along the way, all the way to Louisville, Kentucky, to join the Army, and he became a recruiter for the U.S. colored troops. He was a major influence whose impact survives today. There's still churches that bear the Mars name, and those that don't began because of the efforts of Elijah and his brother, Henry. He also co-founded the Normal Theological Institute of Kentucky, which later became Simmons College. And he helped establish, as I said, several churches in Kentucky. Now, why did she not know that? She's of European descent. There was no reason for her to know that because she was not plugged into the information stream that people who are in like families are connected to. And Mr. Mars, of course, wrote a book about himself. It's quite a neat book to read. And so those folks who have been working on preserving that bit of history would know about the book, would be a member of his church, or a member of some of the many things that he and his brother started in the community. In fact, his church, Beargrass Baptist Church, still exists in the Clifton neighborhood, close to the Italian restaurant over there, Veronese, or of Jane and Frankfurt Avenue, a couple blocks down. So the thing about our history, the history of underrepresented groups, since I'm going to include in that African Americans, Native Americans, women, the working class. I've been in a couple of battles lately where we're defending the history of the working class here in this community. Once the dominant culture recognizes the value of your history, you need to watch out, because they see it as an opportunity for other things. Our history often gets hijacked, so we have folks that see it as a grant opportunity, as an opportunity to spin the history in a way that makes them look good, in a way that distracts from other issues, as a way to divide people and cause a great deal of consternation. A revenue source, the history can become. It can also become an insult to those of us who have a heart in the history, who have worked hard to preserve the history and tell it the best we can. And as I said, a distraction. You see all those historians running down the hill trying to get away from the onslaught. So I'm going to give an example of that. Juneteenth. Now we're all excited about Juneteenth. It's been made a federal holiday. And I tell you what is troublesome to historians about Juneteenth. And this illustration points it out so well. First of all, many people now think that the enslaved population was freed sometime in June. Hallelujah. But in Kentucky, the troublesome thing, in my view, is that it eclipses the very significant August 10th, August 8th celebrations, the emancipation celebrations that used to take place throughout Kentucky. Hoptown and Paducah still has a very strong tradition. There's places in the mountains. We no longer talk about that as if it's not important. These traditions that in many cases evolved into annual family reunions. You see a lot of black families still have their reunions in August, September, October. That's totally gone now because it's Juneteenth. It also promotes the idea that all enslaved people were freed on Juneteenth, and it does not talk about the very complicated situations that resulted afterwards. So it puts a nice frosting on slavery, doesn't it? And now we've all realized what happened and we can celebrate. And it also distracts from a very important, okay, I went too fast. A very important set of circumstances in Kentucky. So I start backing away from the Civil War by introducing May Street Kid, who in 1976 was one of the first 3 African Americans to serve in our state legislature. And she led the charge to ratify in 1976 the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Keep in mind that those amendments were passed without the help of Kentucky a long time ago, right after the Civil War. Uh-oh, see what I did? I like to talk about May Street Kid also because guess where she had her first job? At Mammoth Life Insurance. So I'm finally getting away from the Civil War. A friend of mine said, I hate going to these things because all they talk about is the Civil War. But we needed to start there. We had to start there. Jack, your privileges. And so guess what this is? That's where the Mammoth Life building still resides, up under that horrible shell, which many of us would like to get rid of at some point. And I credit this photo to Brandon Clayco, a fellow who we all still miss, who did a publication called Broken Sidewalks. So if you want to find out more about the building and that sort of thing, he's online still. He's passed away suddenly and sadly some years ago. This is the original Mammoth Life building. And I was in a meeting recently with some folks who are descendants of the founders of Mammoth Life and some of the movers and shakers in the community. And, you know, I mentioned this photo and how wonderful it was, and I said, who built that building for them? And she very indignantly said, we built that ourselves. And so that's the untold story still about the Old Walnut Street. We think of the clubs, we think of those sort of things, but we forget that Old Walnut Street was actually Louisville's Black Wall Street. And besides the clubs, there were businesses of every description. It was, strangely enough, like across the country, a time when African Americans were the most secure in terms of their financial future. They had the most power over their communities in terms of owning retail outlets and the like. And so Black Wall Street is sort of like Juneteenth. We're very excited about that. It's a compelling story. But there's more than one way to wipe out a financial district. In Tulsa, it was a fire. In Louisville, Kentucky, it was urban renewal. We won't belabor that today, but that's important to know. But as a young woman, Main Street kid, actually rented an apartment here, and she eventually went to work there. She met her first husband there. So that takes us to the life and times of P.O. Sweeney, and I'm not going to be able to do justice to P.O. Sweeney, but I would like to talk about some of his contemporaries and how all of these folks contributed to much more than their own businesses, their own livelihood. But they actually were the second realm of foot soldiers to build the black community. So who was Pruitt Owsley Sweeney? How many of you had ever heard of him? Okay. So a couple of you well-informed people. He was a Renaissance man. He was dynamite, and I hope that we do have a chance to have his son here to talk about all the things that he was involved in. But suffice it to say, whenever social change was afoot, wherever there's a political issue in terms of equity or many issues, P.O. Sweeney, among others, just happened to be in the mix. He was one of the most powerful influencers at the time. So it makes it question, we have to question, why is it not more people know about him? Well, once again, history is often hijacked by the superculture, or the powers that be, and they sort of decide what stories are most important for us. And P.O. Sweeney was kind of a challenge to fit into a box. He was, going back to the Mammoth Life building, he was involved with the Mammoth Life Insurance. He was a dentist, a businessman, social activist, farmer. He sold property where the Armory parking lot is downtown, at like 5th and Muhammad Ali. That belonged to P.O. Sweeney. And he at one point sold that property to Mr. Brown, the famous Mr. Brown. And Mr. Sweeney took the proceeds from that and bought a big farm out in Eastwood where he and the family had a dairy farm, and he had racehorses. He was far more than what people would expect. And he wasn't alone. Now, of course, I have to pay homage as president of the Samuel Plato Academy Foundation to our spiritual guide, Samuel Plato. And there he is, pictured with Eleanor Roosevelt. Mr. Plato was one of the first folks, black folks, to get a federal contract to build post offices all over the country. He's with Eleanor Roosevelt. I think it was a housing development for war workers that he built up in the Washington, D.C. area. This is a slide I threw together at the last moment. I wanted you all to see these two structures on the left-hand side. These are structures that are in Marion, Indiana. We have a Broadway temple with the marker that is no longer there. This one of the markers that has disappeared. That's of his construction. And then St. Augustine, which is across the street. He's another example. When I brought up his name to some of our advisors years ago, when we were pulling together the exhibits, I mentioned we were going to do an exhibit featuring Samuel Plato. And her response was, well, you know, he wasn't really an architect. He was a draftsman. And so by her standards, I understand what she was saying. He did not go through the rigors of training that and certification that you associate with architects. But why was that? He was not allowed. He couldn't go to some university and study with his white peers to become an architect. So he was self-taught through home study, and he was raised by a cabinet maker down in Alabama. They were good friends of Booker T. Washington, but quite a talented gentleman who has quite a career as a prolific developer. Plato Terrace, some of you may be familiar with, it's in the Chickasaw neighborhood, were some houses that he and some partners started building to give African-American families after the World War an opportunity to actually buy a house that they could afford. That was a significant thing. Now, one thing I just recently found out about, and this is because of the work that a local group is doing on a book in Chickasaw, and they have brought to the forefront the story of the Westover court case. So very quickly, my understanding is, you all know about Chickasaw Park, and that's the Black Park. Okay. And that's down in the West End, in Chickasaw. And so at one point, Mr. Plato and Mr. Sweeney and some others got together and started working on purchasing some property in what's called the Westover portion of Chickasaw. They've succeeded in buying property, and that's not too far from the Chickasaw Park. When the powers that be found out that black people had bought that property, guess what they did? They sued to take it away from Mr. Plato and from Mr. Sweeney. They did not prevail, but I just shared that story to indicate to you the type of challenges that African-American entrepreneurs and influencers faced during this period. So they accomplished great things, but they were always having to fight in ways that you wouldn't expect. So since I'm not going to be able to do justice to Mr. Sweeney, I did want to share some of his colleagues or some of the folks that lived in what is now the Russell community. That's what we associate with being the Walnut Street district. So Dr. Grace James, and I wanted to also illustrate that it wasn't just men, there were a lot of women involved in building community. And a lot of women and men coming from outside of Louisville, Kentucky to help build community among folks who were like, you know, maybe just 2 generations out of slavery, if that. They had to start from ground zero. So she's a very interesting lady, and she became the first African-American physician, African-American female physician at what used to be called the Children's Hospital very gutsy, always encouraging black women to go into medicine, and with the notion that she used to express that it was racism, sexism, and capitalism that was keeping black women out of medicine. She was something else. Albert Mazik is one of my favorite folks. He was in the tradition of W. Du Bois as opposed to Booker T. Washington, but yet he always maintained a balance between dealing with what we have and trying to work through it, but always looking at a way to move away from what he thought was the greatest enemy to our country, and that was segregation. So one of my favorite stories about him, he was principal at Central High School. He would show up at the Polytechnic Society Library. So that was a library that was available to white people, but on special days, they would open it up to black people. And so Mr. Mazik, I love these kind of people, would show up on the wrong day, and they would say, okay, come in, come in. But after he did it so many times, they said, no more of that. And so based on being tossed out of the library and denied access to the library, he went to the library of Louisville and says, you know, if we can't have access to this library, build us a library. And so from his efforts, they actually built 2 libraries. One we've forgotten about. One was Eastern Library, it was a black library. And the Western Branch, which still stands. But he would do these sort of things saying to himself, this is what we're going to do to deal with it for now. But eventually, we're going to integrate those libraries. I'm a graduate of Indiana University Southeast, and I found out a couple of years ago that we have a campus of Indiana University in New Albany because of the efforts of Mr. Mazik, who was also a graduate of Indiana University. He was very frustrated once again with municipal college or these segregated approaches to higher education in Louisville, Kentucky, once again supporting that, but going to his alma mater and saying, what can you do to bring integrated education to the region? And he was also going back to Walnut Street, involved with the Domestic Casualty and Life Insurance Company. Murray Atkins Wald, I include her because she was another library terrorist, I guess. So once again, it was apparently a custom to allow black people to come into the library at certain times. And so she also was outraged by segregation and would show up at the library at the wrong time and whatnot and invite people to come and do a sit-in. Her approach was, we're going to desegregate these libraries one at a time. Louisville's libraries were finally desegregated. I think Murray Wall started making a fuss in 1941. And finally, 7 years later, in 1948, our libraries integrated in Kentucky.
I want to say one word about this. About Murray Atkins Walls. A number of years ago, I was contacted by the Kentucky Historical Marker people saying, hey, we installed one of her markers out by the Girl Scouts when she integrated the Girl Scouts out over on Lexington Road. Well, we have a second marker for her as well. Can you help us find a place to put that marker? And so again, I knew about her marker or her library advocacy. So I said, it really needs to go right out in front of the library over here. But I'm afraid if I asked to put it up there, they wouldn't allow me to do it. So guess what? I just had it put out there. So if you were to go right outside this door, if it's still there, if it hasn't been stolen, it's right outside these doors, that marker for Murray Atkins Walls. So thank you, Martina, for letting me interrupt.
That's quite all right. And I want to say that I wrote the text for the first Murray Walls, kind of doing a one-up on Steve, the one in front of the Girl Scouts. And so she worked to desegregate the Girl Scouts and Girl Scout camps. And I can't go without mentioning my experience as a Girl Scout years and years ago, decades and decades ago, going to Camp Shanatuck. How many of you know about Camp Shanatuck? So, and apparently it was shortly after she was able to desegregate these camps. We arrived, it was in the dead of night. Our camp building or cabin was full of debris that had been left by the previous white troop. We were told to clean up the mess that was left before, and then, in no uncertain terms, were we to leave it as messy. So when I think of Murray Walls, I wonder what would she think about that? Maybe she would say just sitting about that. Okay. Willis Cole was considered a militant by most of his contemporaries, but if you really wanted to know the real deal about what was going on in the community in terms of what African Americans were experiencing, what was sort of delivered in a milk-down version or not alluded to at all in the local paper, you went to the Louisville Leader, which let it all hang out. And Mr. Sweeney is ever able to present. He has some wonderful examples of how the mainstream media told one story, but the Louisville Leader said something quite different. He was quite ambitious. He started that paper in 1917. It was located at 9th and Muhammad Ali. There's some fabulous pictures, and I hope we can show you sometime of the children that delivered the newspaper. But you know, in time he had a circulation exceeding 20,000. I also like to talk about him because he was an advocate for desegregating public transportation. And then also, he spoke very highly of Mr. Castleman, whose statue has been moved far away from where it was, because both he and Mr. Castleman worked hard to keep public parks desegregated. They started out desegregated, and then as the 20th century wore on, that's when segregation set in. Mr. Castleman fought against that. And in a wonderful editorial in the Courier Journal, Mr. Cole, with probably a half a dozen other leaders, called Mr. Castleman a hero of sorts. So once again, the powers that be get hold of history. They twist it to their use to divide and distract. And that is what happened there. And I was very disappointed when I was one of the folks that was defending keep the statue where it is, when folks began to call Mr. Cole and Uncle Tom, me and Uncle Tom. You see how vicious these battles become when we start to go to virtue signaling and distorting the facts. So watch out. The last person I want to talk about in terms, all these people were involved in businesses and political initiatives, etc., in the Walnut Street district. So you can see why we feel it's so important to get beyond the bars and the nightclubs, which, you know, are worthy of note, to talk about how serious these folks were and what they did to make things better. Mr. Andrew Wade, does anybody know who Andrew Wade was? I'll call on you.
Andrew Wade purchased a home in Shively, I believe, 1954. And he's standing in front of the home that had been shot at.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
You have to start all over again.
okay. This is the Wade family. Andrew Wade and his wife purchased a home in Shively through the Bradens, who purchased it first and then resold it. It was a white neighborhood, and his neighbors burned the cross initially and then began to throw rocks through the windows. Ultimately, shots were fired into the home, and a bomb was placed underneath the home. They persisted.
I like to share this photo of Mr. Wade standing in front of that home. This was one of the markers that the Center for African American Heritage helped subsidize. We had a hard time finding a place to put the marker because the people that currently, or at that time, owned the house did not want that marker in front of that house, even though it's now an integrated neighborhood. So that's one interesting aspect. The other interesting aspect is that until recently, when I was doing some research and actually looking through Mr. Sweeney's stuff, I had not realized that this was Andrew Wade's only call to fame. It was not his only call to fame. That he, like many others, had been in cooperation with people like the Sweeneys, Mazik, Murray Walls, in almost just a wide range of issues, from improving pay for teachers to, it was just amazing how often his name came up. And I do want to share with you, when we were putting this marker up, I went to Mr. Wade, he was still alive at that time, and Ann Braden was still alive. And I went to him to see if he would be at the marker, you know, the unveiling of the marker, and he refused to do so. And I did not press him. Ann Braden, if any of you knew Ann Braden, wanted to press him. But I did not. And I did not understand at the time why not, but I felt it was his right to say, I don't want to do that. Now that I know more about him, I think I understand why. Because now this is all we know about him, and all the hard work he did to improve the plight of African Americans over the years is just totally forgotten. Okay, so what is the legacy of Old Walnut Street? I include a photo of someone we all know well, Ed Hamilton, standing, and I came to know him when I was at the center, and at that time, he was just finishing up the replica, that's a replica of the Civil War sculpture that stands in near Washington, D.C. Ed Hamilton's mother was a barber in this building. How many female barbers do we associate with the period? His father was a tailor, and he talks fondly of, I think WDRB at WLKY did a kind of a neat piece on Walnut Street. He talks fondly of the spirit of Walnut Street and what that propelled him to do. And I think that's a nice picture of Ed. That apparently is the end of my presentation. Any questions or comments or memories?
I have a few. I just want to share that when I was born in the very early 50s and a baby, my uncle, J.E. Hankins, or Julius Hankins, became president of Mammoth Life Insurance Company. So all of my growing up days, I was associated with Mammoth through my uncle. Now that's one uncle that I had. The other uncle of mine, Laval T. Duncan, he was vice president and treasurer of Mammoth Life Insurance Company. So my whole entire world revolved around Mammoth. And even though I didn't know the business aspect of it, I knew these two people in my family that were just so wonderful and just so precious. My Uncle Hank would say that the best way to run a business is to treat everyone, all the employees, as if they're family. And that's the way he ran Mammoth. And Mammoth was a family-oriented type business. My uncle took me out of town when he and my Aunt Jane would go traveling. That's why I was able to see various things in the world. One of the places he took me to was Hampton Institute when I was in high school. And he graduated from Hampton Institute. And he graduated in 1929 and went straight to Mammoth as his first job. And that's where he worked his entire life, at Mammoth. But he took me to the campus. And when I got on campus and I saw all these wonderful black kids walking around together and looking, they were singing in the choir, and I had just never seen such an image. And I told him, I said, I want to go to Hampton, and I did. I went to Hampton and I graduated. So thanks to that kind of family relationship, my life was truly, truly enhanced in a number of ways. And I just think I'm probably one of the luckiest people in the world to have the kind of family that I did. Plus, on top of that, next to Mammoth, there was a drugstore, and my grandfather owned that. That was also at 6th and Walnut. And then 2 blocks down the street at 8th and Walnut, my same grandfather owned a gas station, Frank Standard Oil. So I just was lucky all the way around. But I'm not finished. I had a mom, and she was talking about parks being segregated, and at first they were not, but then they became segregated. Well, after P.O. Sweeney had his lawsuit with the city to fight segregation on the golf courses in the parks, then it was my mother who filed the lawsuit to fight segregation in the parks all over Louisville. And then eventually the parks were open to black people. So I just had history all around me. Thank you.
Well, and thank you, Marcia, who I just met like a couple of weeks ago. I had no idea about that history. And thank you also for reminding us about those lawsuits to desegregate the golf course and the like. I mean, I think that's what most people know about Sweeney. They do know about that lawsuit. And that made national news.
And we're still fighting the lawsuits. We have a lawsuit about the Castleman statue currently. It goes before the Kentucky Supreme Court, I think March the 16th. And we think we're going to win that one. And again, the African American community in the early 1900s were friends of General Castleman. Castleman was the only white person that attended when Booker T. Washington came to town and gave a talk in front of an all-African American audience. And Castleman introduced him when he came to Louisville. So he was a friend of the African American community, and it's unfortunate the twisted history that has happened to that statue. So we're still fighting those battles.
I should also mention Castleman. There was a lynching, a famous lynching that was taking place at the courthouse downtown. And of course, renegades being what they were ready just to storm the jail and wanted to use the military at that time. By then he was regular military with the Army, Union Army after the Civil War, and he stopped that. So you see how toxic these cultural wars can become. No one is saying that Castleman was a perfect person, but there's a lot of detail in there that was not made public in the way that it should have been. You have more to say?
I love that. I hate to say I love the lynching story, but how Castleman stopped the lynching was he took his Louisville Legion, he had about 100 men, went down to the jail to protect the 2 African American prisoners there, and there was a mob of thousands head down there ready to lynch these 2 African Americans. Guess how Castleman stopped them with only 100 men? The day before he got a Gatling gun. He had a Gatling gun set up and said, okay, who wants to go first?
Whoa.
I came today when I saw this about Dr. Sweeney because my grandfather was one of Dr. Sweeney's partners in his movements. A lot, Joseph Brady, R.A.Y. They opened a skating rink at 9th and I was there wrong magazine or Madison, one of them. They actually owned a skating rink, and they would take, then every so often they would have shows, cabarets they call them. They bring the tables and linen in, and you had Cab Calloway, Ella Fitzgerald. They all were there to do a program, as well as, you know, they made the most of every time they had a penny. Then I happened to run across something the other day where Dr. Sweeney was president of the NAACP, and my grandfather was making a presentation to them about the Westover. A lot of them probably didn't even know that Dr. Sweeney and Daddy Ray were partners. And I have a copy of one of the letters that my grandfather had written about the area. You may have seen it because I had given it to them about the place they were actually building there. Those were not swamp lands and all that. And the original deeds for those properties stated that those houses could not be sold to blacks, could only be sold to whites. And actually there was, fortunately or unfortunately, there's always some white person in there who helped the blacks. We couldn't do everything on our own. So there was someone that the actual lawsuit itself was filed by the white person, even though all the legwork and stuff was done by the blacks. But, you know, but they just thought it was black and white, you know, what the results would have been. And this actually went to an appellate court, so it wasn't just something local. But Dr. Sweeney and Joseph Gray, they, a lot of the things they had, again, you know, two main stick in my mind, as I say, are the Westover and the skating rink. And my grandmother gave a lot of my grandfather's papers out to the U of L, and I need to go out there and really, since we're getting more into the, you know, as Marcia said, stuff we took for granted because that was our family, that we had no idea that other people weren't aware of a lot of that stuff. And I guess that's really good. And later on, my grandfather was appointed by President Eisenhower to become the director of Home and Housing Finance in Washington, D.C. So he went there in 1953, and he died there in 57. And at the time of his death, he was the highest paid black on the federal payroll. So, and even, he had a lot, well, any of those people you hear about in that era, though, they all did a lot of things. In addition to that, my grandfather started out when they had what was the bank, I can't even think of it. The bank that was at 6 Long. Anyway, my grandfather started out at that bank as a clerk and ended up becoming the president because the person whose place he took, they went on to become more involved with Mammoth. And this is something else that the insurance companies are not giving enough credit for. They backed many mortgages. Otherwise, the blacks couldn't have bought houses. But, you know, we always take care of the insurance, buy insurance, so when you die, they can bury you, your kids might end up with a couple $100. Now, Mammoth put a lot, and domestic boat, put a lot of people in houses. So I think those two companies really need to be, more needs to be brought up about the other than just sold insurance.
Thank you for that. You're illustrating what a poor job I did in the story. But you point out one thing, let me say this really quick. The tragedy, you know, we talk about the fire in Tulsa and what a horrible thing that was, but the tragedy of urban renewal at that time in the height of Jim Crow, and some survived and some did not. Where were those business people going to go? In the height of Jim Crow, their platform was lost. Their customer base was lost. They had no place to go and start over again. So the tragedy of that, I think we often forget in favor of thinking about the nightclubs or whatever.
The Mammoth building, it was a black office building too. My grandfather had his real estate office in that building for years. It was Ray and Henderson and Mr. Henderson was one time legislator, Dennis Henderson. But there was a couple of doctors who had offices in the Mammoth building. It was, I guess you could call it a black apron building, but they had the doctors and the dentists, and as well as, and then after my grandfather went to Washington, my father continued in the real estate office, and till the things went down, the office was always there. Well, early 60s, I know, because I would leave high school. I finished high school in 61. A lot of times to go over to the Mammoth building just to, if I had something to do, like to wire something to go so he could pick me up and I could ride home with him. So the Mammoth played a big, big part in our history. Both insurance companies, I hate to say just the Mammoth, but just the domestic. because they both played a very influential role in the community.
Just one more question.
One more question. My question is about the entertainment. And she said, entertainment, I just was interested in. I remember there was entertainment on Walnut Street, but I don't know.
Well, okay, these things I was talking about were actually held at the skating rink at 9th and Madison, or Madison, still in.
So it wasn't Walnut Street.
No, this wasn't Walnut Street, this was a special, this was they called it the cabaret, people dressed up in their, women had on their long flowing gowns, and, it was just, and, top notch. Ella Fitzgerald, I remember Cam Keller was at our house when I was a kid. And I don't know who else was there, because I, just can't remember back, but that was, and Joe's was on 13th Street originally.
Joe's was on Jefferson.
Huh?
Joe's was on Jefferson Street.
But it was on 13th Street before we moved it to Jefferson. 13th is right off. But the main thing about the big club on Wall Street was one they called the Top Hat. And it had the glass blocks and the thing. And it was my biggest goal in life one day was to go in the Top Hat when I turned 21. Well, when I turned 21, there was no Top Hat. Yeah, but we had a lot of local entertainment there on Wall Street.
On the south side of Wall
Yeah.
But like what streets?
Like, actually, there was something from 8th Street all the way down to 13th Street. Yeah. You had the restaurants, you had Doctors and Goodies, and, let's see, what else? But some of everything. Anything, it was actually a little community center. As, to say that if you needed something, you had Dr. Nova had the apothecary. You need to go get your medicine. So there was some, there was plenty on Walnut Street. And, to say it was named for one particular thing, no. And I guess the interesting thing is when the big name people with the entertainers would come to Louisville, there were a lot of white people attending these events. They could come down and enjoy it because they enjoyed the music. And as you read about the Harlem Renaissance, the Cotton Club and all that, when the whites enjoyed it as much as the Laureate and some of the blacks. But some of everything, if you needed it, you could get it done on Wall Street. Shoes, clothes, whatever.
But just in listening to you talk, race is another issue. It was not just Walnut Street. It was not just from 13, every black neighborhood had some commerce, and so if you walk away with anything new today, you know that Walnut Street was not just a bunch of nightclubs. You learn that there were movers and shakers in the black community that was helping the black community get its roots, get its moorings, so we could flourish financially. That urban renewal killed all that. It was a lot more than what we typically think of today.